Good afternoon, Mrs. Ramsey.
No, Dad, good afternoon.
That means you can hear and you can see me. Good, that's a good start. Now, you're in Cardiff, are you?
I am. I'm in our offices in Company's House in Cardiff.
And is there anyone there with you?
No, just your IT technician in the next room.
Thank you. What you're talking to, let me describe first what is here at Fleetbank House. We have a reasonable size audience, suitably socially distanced. We have a reasonable cohort of lawyers, again socially distanced, and there is press coverage. You're talking, however, mainly in terms of numbers to those who are beyond these walls. They are watching remotely. I expect there'll be quite a number from Wales, as you might imagine, but it will be across all four nations. Ms. Scott will ask you the questions, but first Mary will ask you to take the oath.
Thank you.
Please state your full name.
Alison Mary Ramsey.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Ramsey.
Good afternoon.
You are employed by the NHS Wales Shared Service Partnership as Director of Planning, Performance and Informatics. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And you say in your witness statement that the partnership, I'm going to call it that for short, is an independent organisation owned and directed by NHS Wales. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that the partnership, together with the Velindre University NHS Hospital Trust, deliver the Welsh Infected Blood Support Service, WIBS, I'm going to call it, for the Welsh Government.
That's also correct.
And that the partnership employs yourself, the WIBS manager, the deputy manager and the finance officer. Is that right?
The deputy manager is an employee of the Velindre NHS Trust.
And the Velindre NHS Trust also employs the welfare team and the psychologists and the team that run the psychology service.
That's correct, yes.
And your role is as the nominated budget holder of the partnership for WIBS.
That's correct.
And you took over. You came into that role in June 2019, taking over from Mr. Martin Riley.
That's correct.
And your role involves line managing the WIBS manager, Ms. Swiffen Walker, discussing new applications and approving them based on her initial recommendations, approving payments of over £10,000 and up to £80,000, and approving the submission of the expenditure forecast to the Welsh Government. Is that an accurate description of your role?
Yes.
Can you tell us what you knew when you took up your role in June 2019 and what you understood about the suffering of those infected and affected who have been infected by with HIV and hepatitis C by blood and blood products?
My own knowledge of the situation was really based upon what I'd read and heard myself in the board media in terms of the infected blood scandal, as it's often referred to in the media. And on application for the role with shared services, there was an element of the role which would be responsible for WIBS. So that was when I undertook more detailed research as to what WIBS was and when it had been set up and what its purpose was. And when I was interviewed for the role, Ms. Swiffen Walker was part of the stakeholder panel, so there were questions around WIBS as part of that initial appointment process.
And has your knowledge changed or deepened during your time in your current role?
Most definitely. There's, as we've heard in evidence this week, a lot of history to how the scheme was established, which I had to quickly get up to speed with. But also, most importantly, I think my understanding of the emotional impact that the infected blood scandal has had on the beneficiaries, not just people living in Wales, but across the UK.
And how have you gained that knowledge about the emotional impact?
I think it's clear in many of the applications that we receive, and importantly, I think in the work that our welfare support team, which makes up one of the 3 component parts of WIBS, has undertaken, and the work that they carry out in particularly. And then more recently also, where we've added to the team the creation of the psychology and the emotional support team, that also has helped us to understand the impact that this has had on individuals and their families.
So that's, are you there describing information that's come from beneficiaries or members of the scheme through the staff structure that we described earlier to
Yes.
your attention?
Yes.
And have you had any meetings yourself with any of the beneficiaries or those infected and affected?
No, I wouldn't in the usual course. No.
Just to set your evidence and WIBS in context, do you know what the current numbers of beneficiaries are on the scheme?
Yes, so we have 176 beneficiaries and 37 widows.
And is it right that widows are not called beneficiaries, albeit they will have received payments from WIBS?
That's true, yes.
So on the books, if I can put it that way, are more than 200 people?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions about the relationship that WIBS has with beneficiaries. First of all, I'm going to just take you to the operational agreement. It's WITN 406 5006. So we can see this is the operational agreement between Welsh ministers and the Velindre NHS Service Trust. And if we go, please, to page 7, and we'll come back and look at, I think we'll come back and look at other provisions of this document, we may not. This is one of the, we can see, well, in fact, we better start at, yes, no page, at the bottom of page, at the bottom of this page, please. Stakeholder feedback. Paragraph 9. Velindre shall establish advisory arrangements involving representatives of scheme beneficiaries to provide regular feedback to Velindre on the effectiveness of service delivery through the WIBS and to help promote good practice. And it's the questions I'm going to ask you now are how that obligation is discharged.
Yeah.
Sherry, you can take that down. You say in your witness statement that in May 2018, the welfare team canvassed beneficiaries to see if they were interested in setting up a specific support group. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and what happened?
So it does predate my time with WIBS, so I am basing my comments on my discussions with members of the team who were in post at the time. So within the first 6 weeks of WIBS being established, the welfare team did make contact with all the beneficiaries that had transferred to make themselves known to them. And then on the back of that, a few months down the line, they canvassed them, as you say, to ask them about whether or not there was interest in some sort of advisory support group. We had 15 beneficiaries indicated that this would be something that they would be interested in doing. And so we were looking to move to next steps. But in and around the same time, as I understand things, there was also quite a lot of activity going on with the establishment of the inquiry, and also the cross-party Senate group were having a number of meetings with some beneficiaries. And we did receive some feedback, again, direct to the welfare team, that there was a general sense it was starting to feel a little bit too much all at the same time. And so we paused our plans at that stage. And we did contact the 15 who'd indicated an interest to let them know of that decision. And then we let things lie for a little while. When we have now created the psychology and the emotional support team, we are in the process of, again, now looking at how we are best able to establish that advisory beneficiary support group network through that route. And unfortunately, that has been a little destabilised by the pandemic in the last 12 months, because we'd hoped we would have been able to have picked up the pace again with that arrangement.
But that, if I can put it this way, is something for on the to-do list, is it?
Yes, yes.
There is a governance group, and I'm just going to take you to the terms of reference of that and try and understand how that fits into the picture. It's HSSG 40175. Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme Governance Group terms of reference. And if we look over to the next page, we can see under 2, heading authority, and the second paragraph there, it's empowered with the responsibility for reviewing and advising on the management of WIB's budgets, including running costs, etc., advising WIB, the Welsh Government on rate changes and the potential financial and service implications of policy changes within Wales and other areas within the UK, implementation of Welsh Government policy, ongoing negotiation and partnership with Welsh Government to ensure the smooth running of the service. And then if we go down to the next section, membership, it includes Velindre NHS Trust members, partnership members, WIBS members, Welsh Government members. The Senior Welfare Rights Manager, is that from the welfare team of WIBS?
Yeah, yes, that's correct, yes.
The consultant psychologist, again, presumably the psychologist that's involved with the psychology service run by WIBS.
That's correct, yes.
And then it says their service user. Is there a service user on that group?
No, so there is a seat, if you like, for a service user, but it's currently unfilled. And that is something which we're hoping that we will be able to use the establishment of the stakeholder group to resolve in terms of how we fill that post and position.
And when you say the establishment of the stakeholder group, what there are you referring to?
So, as in answer to my previous question, where I mentioned that we would be looking to work with the psychology and emotional wellbeing team to establish the support network group. Sorry, I haven't used the phrase stakeholder group, but the support network, to identify maybe from that an appropriate service user to represent the others. I think in our discussions as a governance group, we have talked about the fact that we haven't had a service user on the group since it's been established as the governance group. There were some service users involved in the establishment of WIB, so I understand from my colleagues, but they decided to step back once the scheme was fully established, and that's when the governance group came into play. But it is something that we have discussed and would want to have on board most definitely.
So the plan is, first of all, to fill this seat on the governance group with a service user, and secondly, to have a parallel or another group made up predominantly of of beneficiaries, service users?
Yes, that would be the aspiration.
And do you have an idea about what the role of that group would be?
I mean, it's intended to be a support group for the beneficiaries themselves, and we would envisage that that group would maybe nominate a service user to then sit on the governance group, and that would provide a channel then for views to be communicated in a more formal way. Whereas now at the moment, the way in which we get the views of the beneficiaries is from their direct contact with any element of the 3 parts of the team.
And so the governance group would give a formal mechanism for the views of the membership to be fed into the governance of the organisation. In other words, how you do things.
It would.
And are there any formal mechanisms or any plans for obtaining the views of the membership in the policy aspects of the scheme?
The main purpose for this role would be more around the day-to-day running of it. I would see it more as a matter for government to determine how they involve beneficiaries in the policy setting elements.
And are you aware of any formal mechanisms by which the government engage the beneficiaries in questions of policy?
I think in the past I'm aware that they have run some consultation and surveys.
I've seen reference in the documentation that's been provided by yourself and your colleagues to certainly one newsletter. Does WIBS produce newsletters for the membership?
Yes, it does. They're on our website under the resources tab.
And do you have any other than the methods we've discussed, any other ways of keeping in touch with the beneficiary community?
So I'd probably cite 3 avenues. We have our public website, which is what we use for most of the updating and posting of information relating to WIBS. We have our biannual newsletter, which we use as a means of promoting the different elements of the scheme, so making sure that people are aware of the welfare support team and more recently the psychology and the emotional support team. In the last 12 months, we've also used the newsletter to signpost to additional information relating to COVID, which may have been relevant to our beneficiaries. And also our welfare team do have fairly regular contact with a number of our beneficiaries, so we do also use that as an avenue, as well as the sessions that the counsellor and psychologist would be having. But I must stress that they would not be sharing any personal or individual information. They would be working more on sharing more on common themes that might be emerging from their sessions.
And I'll come on to ask you some questions about the welfare team and the non-financial support that WIBS provides later on this afternoon.
Can I just be clear on this? You said there were 3 ways of communicating. One's the website, the second is the newsletter. What's the third?
With our welfare team.
Thank you.
What would what's your understanding or your assessment, if I can put it that way, of the relationship between the scheme and its members?
I mean, I can base that on the I suppose physically when I walk into the team's office, there are a number of notes and cards of thanks. So I would describe it as a generally positive relationship in terms of the ability of the team to provide assistance and support.
Just to understand, I'm going to ask you some questions now about understanding the division of responsibility between the Welsh Government and the scheme itself. Is it right to understand that all of the policy decisions about who's eligible for the scheme, levels of payment and so on, are made by the Welsh Government and are not made by the scheme itself?
That's correct.
And that the scheme's role, WIBS's role, is to implement those policy decisions made by the Welsh Government?
That's correct.
Does WIBS have a role in advising the Welsh Government on policy?
We would sometimes undertake some desktop research where there have been changes to the scheme, where we may have looked at what other schemes were doing and pulled that together in an advisory paper for Welsh Government, but the decision always sits with Government. And
it might be helpful to look at one of those papers, and I appreciate this is before your time, so you, if you can't answer, then do say. But the document is HSSG 0020018. So we can see here that this is a 22nd of March 2018 report from the WIBS manager, Ms. Swiffen Walker. And it says the purpose of the report is to update the Welsh Government on how WIBS has been operating, provide data to inform a decision on what the rates should be uplifted to in April 2018, and to consider options for introducing the special category mechanism in Wales. Now, I'm not going to go to what's in the report, other than just to look at very briefly at the bottom of page 6. If we go to the bottom of that page, in the conclusion box, to ensure an equitable service where all WIBS beneficiaries receive an uplift on their current rate and none are disadvantaged, and then a recommendation is made as to what the Welsh Government should do. And equally, if we look at the last page, page 8, there's a recommendation on the special category mechanism in the conclusion box at the bottom there. We recommend the Welsh Government adopt the SCM or a similar system, and the reason is given our beneficiaries would not be disadvantaged under our scheme compared to those in the English scheme, and then a costs analysis is carried out. Shemit, you can take that document down now. Would this report have been commissioned by the Welsh Government, or are these reports of this nature something that WIBS would do of their own volition because they think it's something the Welsh Government ought to know about?
I can't comment on this actual paper because I wasn't around at the time, but in terms of how it would work and operate now, it's the kind of example of something that would be probably discussed at the governance group, and we would, as a result of an outcome of that meeting, we would agree to take it away and work up a paper with some proposals and a preferred option or a recommendation. That's how it would work now, so I have no reason to believe that probably wasn't the spirit of how it was working at that time.
And does the Welsh Government consult WIBS on policy changes? So, for example, were WIBS consulted on the recent changes that were announced in March to increase parity amongst the 4 schemes?
Yes, we were notified that there were some discussions taking place and that there was likely to be an announcement forthcoming, but we weren't privy to the details of that announcement until the sort of embargoed press release the evening before, really, and that was intended so that we could have a full complement of staff in place and manning phones, etc., should we have had any phone calls or contact from beneficiaries.
So kept up, is this an accurate way to describe it? Kept up to date that there were discussions and likely to be announcements, but not consulted in terms of the substance as to what the position the Welsh Government should take should be? Yes,
I think that would be a fair comment.
I'm going to move on to a different topic now, which is work done to identify new beneficiaries for the scheme. We've been hearing evidence this week from the other schemes in devolved nations that when the schemes were set up, they were not provided with contact information of those individuals who had made applications to the Alliance House organisations and had been refused. Again, I appreciate this is before your time, but is that your understanding that the position is the same for WIBS? They were not given a list of Welsh applicants that had been declined by the Alliance House organisations?
That's correct. It was the same scenario for WIBS.
How would WIBS treat an application from such an applicant?
We would accept an application from somebody who'd previously been refused by the Allied House organisations. We'd strongly encourage all applicants to contact the team directly so that we could have an initial conversation to understand some of the circumstances and a bit of the background information so that we might be able to give an initial assessment around probability and to build an initial picture so that we would be able to then guide them as to what additional information they may need to support their application.
And I'm going to come on and ask you some questions about the application process a little bit later on. But so is it right then that simply because somebody has been turned down by the Alliance House organisations, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't succeed if they applied to WIBS? They may do. You would consider the application on its merits.
exactly that.
In your witness statement, you've suggested that you would seek information from the Skipton Fund, who now is holding the Alliance House organisation's data, to obtain some information from them. Is that what you would do or have done?
So for any new application, we do ask Russell Cook, who now acts on behalf of, because they're holding the records for AHOs, we would ask them to confirm whether or not they hold any information on the applicant, whether that be confirmation that they were previously on the scheme and any details that they might have held, or whether or not they've made any previous application have been unsuccessful, and if they have any records that they might be able to share with us relating to that application.
And have Russell Cook been prepared to share with you any records that they do hold on such an individual?
Yes, they have. It can be quite a it takes quite a long time for them to be able to pull those records out. But I do appreciate that many of these records may be paper-based, so not as accessible maybe as electronic documents. But yes, they have been able to. And
presumably that process is contingent on the person applying to you giving consent for those documents to be shared.
Yeah.
What do WIBs do with the information and documentation that you receive from from Russell Cook? Does that feed into the determination of an application?
I think the numbers where that's been occurred have been very small. So, but yes, we would take the in terms of the application process, I suppose we would take the original application form from the applicant with the supporting information from their consultant physician or GP, and we would only really look to the Russell Cook information if we were in a position where we might be looking at the whether or not they've previously been on the scheme and been in receipt of previous payments.
And if they had been in receipt of previous payments, presumably they are automatically registered onto the WIBS scheme?
Yes.
And so it's only if they've been turned down that you would then have to determine the application on its merits?
Yes, exactly that.
In terms of this cohort of potential beneficiaries who've applied to the Alliance House organisation and been turned down, is there anything that WIBS has done to try and get the message across to them that it may still well be worth their while making an application to WIBS?
I think it's fair to say that that's only happened when somebody has made the contact direct with us, and on reflection maybe there is more that we could do to put that message out.
Do you have a plan or an idea of what more that could be?
I think that's something we'd need to consider.
Would you, for example, be prepared to put something on your website at least to that effect?
Yes, I think at least that would be a minimum.
You have set out in your witness statement the steps that WIBS has taken so far more generally to identify new beneficiaries, and you've identified that in 2019 a leaflet was provided to haemophilia centres, and more recently in February 2021 an e-leaflet was delivered, I think you said, to all GP practices in Wales. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And is that the totality of the steps that WIBS has taken to identify new beneficiaries?
Yes, I think other than the information that's available on the public website, that would be fair.
And does WIBS do any kind of analysis to understand whether there are any gaps in the beneficiary cohort? So, for example, whether there's areas of Wales where there are no beneficiaries, or where there are patient groups, again, where nobody has applied, which might suggest that there's a lack of information in that particular geographical area or that particular cohort of patients?
No, we don't do any regular analysis like that.
Is that something that WIBS would be able to do, given the data that you do hold?
I think my understanding is if we were to do that, it would be quite a manual exercise. We'd have to troll back all the records on the application. So it is something that's now at the forefront of my mind in terms of our databases and systems, how we could better maybe record that data to pull off such information in the future. But as we sit at the moment, we would have to do that as a look-back exercise quite manually.
So, for example, if WIBS were to want to know whether or not there were applicants any applicants at all who had been infected as a result of treatment for either sickle cell anemia or thalassemia, it would be a question, would it, of going back through the records manually to identify whether there are any such beneficiaries.
Yes, it would, I'm afraid.
And given that we understand from other information that the inquiry has received that the Alliance House organisations gave very limited information to the schemes on setup about the beneficiaries that were transferring over, what kind of information would you have about the Alliance House organisation beneficiaries that have transferred over? Would you have that kind of information?
It'd be highly unlikely, is my understanding. It was only a very minimum data set that transferred over with most of the Allied House organisations.
So unless somebody has made a subsequent application to WIBS because they want a discretionary payment, or they want to go on to the enhanced hepatitis C payment, or do want to go from stage 1 to stage 2, you really have very limited data about them.
That's correct. It would be more likely that a new applicant is where we would have the scenario where we would have some more clinical information available.
Just going to ask you now some questions about the criteria for entry onto the scheme. Now, you've already told us that that's criteria that's set by the Welsh Government, not by WIBS, and it's WIBS's job to apply that criteria. But just so that it's clear where that criteria comes from, is it right to understand that it's the directions, the 2017 directions issued, that set out the criteria that you are applying when somebody makes an application to the scheme?
Yes, the directions set the legal framework for the scheme, is correct.
And one of the criteria that WIBS is applying is in relation to cut-off dates for treatment. Is that correct? So somebody that is infected with hepatitis C must have had the treatment causing the infection before September 1991.
That's my understanding.
In my reading of the, in my preparation for asking you questions today, I noticed that the directions don't include that provision. Do you know where that comes from, that cut-off date? If it's not in the directions, where would WIBS be getting that from?
So the cut-off date is set out in the internal staff guidance document, which I believe you do have a copy of. And the staff guidance document would have been approved by the governance group.
So although it's not in the directions, the governance group, which has members of the Welsh Government sitting on it, can amend the criteria, if you like, for eligibility through the governance group.
Well, eligibility criteria is set out in the at a high level, and yes, the guidance document then goes into much more detail, I suppose, and is more of an operational manual handbook type of document. So that does go into more detail than you would naturally expect to see maybe in regulation.
Can we just look then at the directions? It's HSSG 0020052. You can see that's the blood, the directions number 2, 2017. And so if we can just see who the qualifying, if we go over to page 3, we can see under eligibility, payments can be made to qualifying persons and surviving spouses, partners or dependent children of qualifying persons who have died. And if we go over to the next page, page 4, we can see that there provisions for payments under paragraph 5 to bereaved spouses and partners, and here is lump sum bereavement payments and annual payments, either, I think at that point, in a lump sum or annual payments for 3 years. And then paragraph 6, payments where there's no surviving spouse or partner to a dependent child. And then the schedules set out what those payments are. But if we could go to the page 10. It sets out what discretionary payments are available in the form of grants, and they can be made to qualifying persons as a result of illness. So that's your primary beneficiaries and your secondary beneficiaries. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then to the surviving spouses, partners and dependent children of qualifying persons as a result of the death of the qualifying person. So is it right to understand that the categories of beneficiary are primary beneficiaries, i.e. those who have been infected with hepatitis C or HIV from their treatment with blood and blood products; secondary beneficiaries, i.e. those people that have been infected by the primary beneficiaries; the bereaved community, i.e. the partners and dependent children of those that have died; and then more recently the estate as well is also able to claim some payments.
That's correct.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about the application process itself, and you've already told us a little bit about how it works when somebody has already made an application to the Alliance House organisations. Can we look at the guidance, the internal guidance, which is at WIBS 602? And you can see there at the top it says internal use only, and then assessment of chronic stage 1 hepatitis C infection applications. Now, I'm going to go through this guidance, but it looks very similar to the guidance that we looked at on Tuesday with in the Scottish scheme. Again, I appreciate this, it was before your time, but do you know where this guidance came from or who drew it up, and why it's so similar to the Scottish guidance?
Yes, so because the Scottish scheme were a little ahead of us in their establishment, we did approach them for examples of their guidance documents, their templates, their application forms, and they were generous enough to share those with us. So we didn't reinvent the wheel. We used what another scheme was effectively using already, and then we have adjusted it for any differences that exist between the schemes.
The first, under the heading chronic hepatitis C, the test is set out. That's the eligibility criteria and what somebody has to show in order to qualify chronically infected with hepatitis C as a result of treatment prior to September 1991, and that's judged on the balance of probabilities. And then guidance is...
May I just ask, it may, to the casual reader, seem that there are two possible ways of interpreting what is said about chronic infection. Whether it's chronic infection, i.e. an infection which has been chronic for more than 6 months, or that the words in brackets simply explain what chronic means, that is, an infection you've had for more than 6 months. Do I take it that it's the latter that was meant and intended and has been applied?
Yes, that would be correct.
Thank you.
And then it sets out what the balance of probabilities principle means. Assessor must make their own decision. And then what they have to conclude that the chronic hepatitis C infection is more likely than not to have resulted from the NHS treatment, etc. And it goes on to say in the second paragraph, it needs to be probable that the chronic infection arose as a direct result of NHS treatment with blood and blood products, and probable means that the probability that the event happened is more than 50%. And then it gives an example of what would be highly probable: somebody with haemophilia being infected with unscreened blood products, and improbable, an injecting drug user being infected via a single blood transfusion, even if they had received one, unless that specific batch was confirmed as infective. And the assessor must be persuaded of the existence of the chronic hepatitis C infection, and that it's likely the applicant received relevant NHS treatment before the claim can be successful. Each claim must be assessed on its own merits and the evidence available. Generally speaking, the standard of proof will not be satisfied by inexact evidence, indefinite witness statement, or indirect references. And then if the assessor ranks the possible causes in terms of probability and concludes that one is more probable than the others, then they are entitled to conclude that route is the probable cause of infection. So that's the test that's applied, is it, on applications by WIBs?
It is, yes, and there's two parts to that. The applicant themselves is asked to make a statement, and then they are also asked to ask their consultant physician or GP.
I'm afraid we lost you. You froze after you said the applicant. You said the applicant themselves is asked to make a statement, and then they are also asked to ask their consultant physician or GP, and then we lost you.
Yes, so the second part of the form, the application form, requests the consultant physician or GP to also support the application.
And if we just turn over the page, please, we can see, again, something we saw on the Scottish guidance, this principle of the benefit of the doubt. In borderline cases where there's viewed to be around a 50% chance of the infection having occurred as a result of infected NHS blood, tissue or blood products, the benefit of the doubt should be given in favour of the applicant. That is, if the applicant's story is on the whole coherent and plausible, any remaining element of doubt should not prejudice the assessor's decision. The claim should be coherent and plausible, not contradicting generally known facts, and on balance, capable of being believed. And then it goes on to say no facts should be discounted in the evidence gathering exercise unless they are claimed to lack credibility. And then missing out the next paragraph, the guidance then goes on to give some assistance as to what is to be done where there are, as I read this, a lack of medical records evidencing a treatment that is said to have caused the infection. Although it's ultimately for the applicant to substantiate the application, in borderline cases where aspects of the applicant's statements are not supported by documentary or other independent evidence, the assessor may judge that those aspects shall not need confirmation when the following 5 conditions are met, and then the conditions are set out. So is it right to read this guidance that if a applicant does not have medical records that show the treatment that they say caused their infection, that is not fatal to the claim if these 5 aspects, 5 elements, conditions can be met?
That's correct.
And those conditions are that the applicant's made a genuine effort to substantiate his or her application. Now, just pausing there, what's meant by that? Is that trying to obtain the medical records themselves?
That could be one of the component questions that we might consider and ask. Yes, but, what have they done to try to secure their records? We obviously know that the absence of medical records is a key theme to many of the cases, and then we would also ask whether or not they've had the opportunity to discuss with their current clinician or former clinicians whether or not they would be able to provide supporting evidence in support of their application. That might be another example of something that we would ask.
And is it right that when applicants approach WIBs and discuss their applications with the welfare team, that assistance is given by WIBs to help them to get their medical records?
Yes, so we will, if it could be helpful, approach a health board and ask to see if they can do a look to see on health records. But more often than not, I think we would recognise that the applicant and the circumstances of many of these applications, it's less likely that the records are going to be still in existence. But what we will also do is turn to clinical coding, and we will look to see whether or not perhaps we can substantiate that a particular procedure did take place, and that would give us another sort of element of credibility and plausibility to the application. We could maybe pinpoint at least that the procedure had taken place, and then we may also then supplement that by seeking a medical advisor opinion, whether or not that procedure being undertaken at that point in time. What might be the likelihood that that individual might have received a transfusion, as an example.
So we've heard other witnesses describe that as whether or not it's clinically plausible that the particular procedure would have required blood or blood products. Is that what you're describing?
Yes, exactly that.
And who would you go to obtain such an opinion?
So I think in my evidence I cite 3 or 4 medical advisors that we used on a fairly consistent basis. More often than not, it's the 2 haematologists that we've referred cases to.
And when you do that, do you inform the applicant that that's what you're doing and give them the information that the advice you've been given by the expert?
We would, when we think that through, I suppose we wouldn't necessarily tell them before we were doing it, because we would be looking to try to process the application, and we're not sharing personal information. We're providing a scenario to the advisor more so. So we wouldn't necessarily be doing that beforehand, but we would certainly, when we were updating them on progress with their claim, let them know what we had then done, and in the event that we're going back to them with an outcome, we would certainly explain to them if we had sought a medical advisor's opinion to try to support their application.
And how frequently do you take this step of looking at clinical plausibility? Is that something you do invariably when there is not medical records to support the application?
Yes, I would say where there's no medical records, this is our usual approach.
And if the view comes back that it's clinically implausible, is that in practice, in effect, really the death knell for the application, or has an application ever survived the clinician's view that it's clinically implausible?
I think it would be highly unlikely that we would approve an application if we had a view that it was clinically implausible. But I would stress that if we were to go back with somebody with a decline on an application or a rejection, I suppose, for want of a better way of explaining it, then we would always make it clear that the door remains open, that if they did receive or come across any additional information, that we would always reconsider that application. So I wouldn't quite describe it as the death nail, but because we do always leave the door open with any application in that regard, and they do obviously have the right to appeal the decision as well.
And does WIBS have the ability to, or does WIBS have the ability to obtain more general information and advice about medical practices, either during a certain time period, or in a certain hospital, or in a certain discipline, which might inform the clinical plausibility assessment?
I don't know whether or not we've ever done so within a specific hospital setting, but certainly in terms of time frame and procedure, yes, we have done that.
And would that come from the clinician that you're referring the matter to, or does that come from elsewhere?
It would usually be from one of those clinicians, yes.
So that would be part of the information you would be seeking from them to be assessing this on the basis that it happened in 1973 and it was a whatever kind of procedure. You would expect them to take that into account.
Yes.
Going back then to the 5 criteria on the guidance, all relevant elements at the applicant's disposal have been submitted and a satisfactory explanation regarding any lack of other relevant elements has been given. Applicant's statements are found to be coherent. And pausing there, actually, in terms of B, that suggests that there's very much a sort of to and fro process between WIBS and the applicant to try and plug any gaps. Is that how the application process works?
Yes, that's fair. Yes.
C, the applicant's statements are found to be coherent and plausible and do not run counter to available specific and general information relevant to the applicant's case. So what is being referred to there about general information relevant to the case?
I think that would be probably the most likely example would be the one that you've already cited, really, that the absence of a medical record as the example. We do now know that is likely to be the case with applications that we do receive. So that would not, in and of itself, stand out as an unusual or an unsatisfactory explanation for why the application isn't complete, as it were.
So that wouldn't, in effect, given what you know generally about records and record keeping, that wouldn't be a mark against the applicant.
No, and I think it's also important to recognise that on the initial application, where the applicant makes their own statement and then their current clinician or GP also makes a supporting statement, if that clinician, the one who currently knows them well, is prepared to support the statement, then on the balance of probabilities we would approve it.
And then the applicant has applied to the scheme as early as possible following diagnosis, unless there's a good reason for not having done so. What's the relevance of that?
I suppose it goes back. I can't actually think of an example of where that's been a concern, but most where I think it would be around whether or not, because there's been some publicity around the schemes for a long time. Haemophilia Wales in particular played a very valuable role in helping us to promote awareness of WIBS within Wales. So I think it would just raise a query as to why it's taken so long to come to us to make an application.
So it calls for an explanation?
Yes. But as I say, I can't think of an example where actually we've relied upon this one as not supporting an application.
And then information provided suggests that the applicant is generally credible. How easy or difficult is it for WIBS to form a view about general credibility on a paper application?
I think in fairness, in terms of the volume of applications we have, we've probably grown in experience, knowledge and understanding. I think that would be fair, but I don't think we've ever struggled to form a view, and certainly the spirit of the team is always, have we gone as far as we can? Is there anybody else we could ask, and is there more that we could do at this stage? And as I say, and we always leave the door open if more information is forthcoming from the applicant at a later point in time.
And have you approved new applicants coming onto the scheme who have not got medical records which show the treatment that they say caused their infection?
Yes, we've approved applications where we haven't had the medical records, but we have only ever approved applications which would have supporting medical advice.
And that's what you're talking there about the treating clinician or the clinical plausibility from the clinicians that you approach.
Exactly that, yes.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about the enhanced hepatitis C payment. And I'm going to ask you to look, please, at the application form while we do that. So we heard a bit of information about that this morning, and I just wanted to just look at the application form with you, just to understand in practice how you go about dealing with these applications. So it's WIBS 5081. So here we've got Form L, application to receive enhanced Stage 1 plus payments. And there's the declaration on the front of the application. And this is the same declaration on the front of all the application forms, isn't it? And it has, just to pick up what we were talking about earlier, at the penultimate paragraph, I agree to NHS Wales obtaining any data on me by the Skipton Fund or the Caxton Foundation for the purposes of providing me with financial support. So that's where the consent comes for you to approach Russell Cook. And then if we go over to page 3, please, we can see that the form requires the applicant to fill out their details in section 1B, and then section 1C is where they set out their basis of their application. Are you suffering from any mental health or wellbeing issues, stroke post-traumatic stress, yes or no? If yes, please give detail. And then if we go over to the next page, if yes, do you think these issues are related to your infection from contaminated blood or blood products, yes or no? If yes, are your symptoms affecting your ability to carry out day-to-day activities, yes or no? And then thank you for completing this form. Is it right to understand that if somebody fills one of these application forms in, then they will receive the payment? Are there any circumstances in which you would look at what's been put on the form and say, no, they don't qualify for the payment?
No, we would approve the payment.
So in a sense, once somebody's filled out this form, there isn't an assessment process that WIBS goes through. It's an administrative process.
It was always intended to be a self-assessment application process by the beneficiaries themselves. So yes, there's no secondary check or assessment process.
Shemit, you can take that down. What would you say are the benefits, both from a WIBS perspective and if you have any insight from a beneficiary perspective, of a self-certification process for this payment?
I think from my own view, it's around the relationship of trust between ourselves and the beneficiaries, which has been very important. But also, I am aware that at the time when the form was being developed and the WIBS Enhanced Special Payment Category Stage 1 Plus was being pulled together, that we did have some discussions with clinicians around the additional benefit per se of having a separate assessment process which would involve a clinician, and they raised some concerns around the potential trauma of asking existing beneficiaries on the scheme to relive, reopen back up and re-explain, re-justify maybe how they're feeling, why they're feeling that. I think the other advantage that we put in place at the same time was that there was the commitment that we would also be establishing the psychology and the emotional support team, and there was an implication that the team would make contact with the beneficiaries who were then accepted onto this category of the scheme, so that there would be an offer of support in a practical sense, not just in a financial one.
I'm going to move on then now to ask you some questions about the discretionary payments, so the one-off grants. You have given us the numbers of applications in your witness statement. So if we can just have a look at that, just to set this information in context. It is WITN 4506001. There we are. We can see the front page of your statement. And if we can turn, please, to page 20. Right at the bottom there, you say the number of discretionary grant applications which have been approved, see table, and then the left-hand column is year, right-hand is amount, and so we go over the page. We can see then that first year 2, 12, second year then up 10, and then the third year is 3, but that's only for half of the year, so a total of 27 applications. And you explain in your witness statement that it wasn't until shortly before you wrote that statement that there was any information on the website to make beneficiaries aware that they could make these applications. Is that correct?
I couldn't comment as to whether or not we'd not previously made them aware, but we certainly didn't have the information on the website at the time.
Do you think that might be an explanation as to why there were such low numbers of applications?
Well, the information would have been available via our welfare support team as well, and also through the WIBS manager as well. So we would have been able to have signposted to grant applications. I'd need to check whether or not we'd ever made any reference in the newsletters previously around the small grant scheme. I couldn't confirm at this point.
So one of the, and again we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but you would be expecting, would you, the welfare team to be signposting people to encouraging people to make applications for grants, should that be appropriate?
Yes, it is an avenue open to them, yes, most definitely.
Can we look at the information that is on the website at the moment, as I understand it? It's WIBS 5063. And here it's called WIBS Small Grants Criteria, and we've got descriptions down the left-hand side, and then an indicative maximum amount in the middle column, and then an example of expenditure. So, first of all, is the item descriptions, is that an exhaustive list, or can people make applications for grants that aren't on that list and you would consider them?
I mean, we'd sincerely hope that would capture most reasonable requests and sort of regular asks, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list, no.
And then you say right at the bottom of the document, each application will be considered on its merits, and the above figures are indicative of maximum awards only. Alternative streams of funding will be considered where appropriate, such as local authority or local health boards, and then you offer free welfare assistance to complete the grant application. Please get in touch to arrange this. And that's what you've been discussing earlier, that the welfare team will be talking people through and helping them to fill out such application forms. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And then you tell us in your witness statement that these grants are not means tested. Is that right?
That's correct.
That we can go to the form if it assists. It's Form J, but that form requires the applicant to fill in, to give information about income and expenditure. So, for example, 3 months of bank statements and evidence of household income and expenditure. Why is that information required in an application for a grant that is not means tested?
The welfare team would also use that information to assess whether or not there may be other grants, perhaps offered by DWP or other organisations, which the beneficiary would be entitled to also apply for.
So, if somebody is effectively somebody's approaching WIBS in order for a one-off grant, and then WIBS is taking the opportunity to try and capture more information to give a sort of more holistic assessment of what the person's needs might be. Is that
yes,
right?
We don't take the information into account in considering whether or not we would grant the small grant application in and of itself.
And have you ever had any pushback or any concerns raised by applicants about having to provide that level of information to get a grant?
Not that I'm aware of myself, no.
Is it right that you never never refused an application for a discretionary grant?
That's correct.
And we heard evidence this morning from Mr. Gething about the future of discretionary grants, and his evidence was it's to be discussed. Is that your understanding as well?
It is, yes.
I'm going to ask you now some questions about discretionary income top-up payments. Both your evidence and the evidence of Mr. Gething suggests that these top-up payments were paid in respect of transferring beneficiaries from the Alliance House organisations who already had those payments, and that's correct. And the number of those beneficiaries is about 15.
Yes.
And so, is it right to understand that your understanding is that they are not available for new applications for such payments wouldn't be granted?
So as WIBS is established, there is no top-up element to the scheme at all. So you're correct in that there's no ability for us to consider new top-up applications. But where the transferring beneficiaries were in receipt of income top-up, we have continued to honour those payments.
I'm just going to show you a document just to see if you can identify it and understand where it comes from. It's HSSG 002 0023. It's called Income Top-Up and Discretionary Support 2018-19, and it looks like it's sort of one of the documents from WIBS that might be on the website, and it says it outlines the support available through WIBS in 2018-19, and then it refers to this discretionary support guidance booklet, which we've also got, which says in much more detail what's said in this document. And it suggests that their income top-up payments are available, a discretionary monthly payment to increase the household income to help with general living costs. An assessment is made of the beneficiary's household income, and if the income is below set thresholds, an application can be made to receive regular payments. What do you make of this? This is contrary to what you understand, is it?
Yes, I hadn't had sight of this document prior to it being brought to my attention as part of the inquiry, so I have had to make some inquiries myself as to what its basis is and where it's come from. So my understanding from speaking to members of the team who were in position in around 2018-19 is that there was at the time some discussions with colleagues in Welsh Government as to whether or not we would consider an income top-up scheme within Wales. And as part of those discussions, the WIBS team were asked to effectively draft what guidance and documentation would or could look like. And this is an example of one of those draft documents. And I would say that we would probably, with the benefit of hindsight, should have marked it as draft.
So this should not be treated. This is not a policy that ever came into being.
Not a policy, as far as I'm aware, that ever came to fruition. It was drafted as part of discussions and considerations that Welsh Government were having around income top-up payments, and I think as a consequence of some of the announcements made to increases in annual payments by other schemes, and the discussions around parity then sort of overtook events effectively.
And can we just look then just below income top-up at the payments for children of beneficiaries with HIV and hepatitis C? Again, these are similar payments to those that we saw being given by some of the Alliance House organisations. Payments for children of beneficiaries with HIV and hepatitis C suggest that payments might be available, first child £250 a month and subsequent child £100. Again, is this something that never came into being?
Yes, that's true. It's the same paper, yes. No.
Same paper, but there has never been a policy of making such payments to beneficiaries for children.
The only payments that dependent children are able to receive is similar to that of widows, so they are entitled to the £10,000 bereavement payment and also the 75% tapered payment relief over 3 years. And
that's a payment that they would get themselves. This is a payment the payment here is one that would be paid to the beneficiary for the upkeep of the child.
Yes, I understand that. No, we haven't got this arrangement in place.
I've just got one question in relation to the annual bereavement payments. We've seen in other schemes at various times a provision that such payments are not to be made if the widower, spouse, partner, cohabitee remarries. Is that something that's ever been a feature of the Welsh scheme?
No,
to
it
your
hasn't.
knowledge? Going to ask you some questions now. I've been saying I'm going to ask you these questions about the other services, the non-financial services that WIBS provides. I'm going to look, I think, first of all at the Memorandum of Understanding. So that's WITN 406 5007. So here we can see Memorandum of Understanding for the management and administration of the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme between the Welsh Ministers and Velindre Trust. And if we can turn, I'll just find my notes, to page 6, please. Section 6 sets out the responsibilities, and they first of all sets out 6.2, the Welsh Ministers. Yes?
And I've got a message come up saying that my Wi-Fi has just dropped out, so I don't know if I may just need to pause and get your technician to...
Well, so I note the time. It's nearly 3:15. I've probably only got about another 15 minutes, but I don't know whether now is a good time to take a break given the potential Wi-Fi issues.
At the moment we're hearing you and seeing you.
Okay.
So shall we go on for 15 minutes? There'll then have to be a break for questions from other participants to ask questions through Council, and that might be the time to check the Wi-Fi.
Yes, I'm happy to proceed on that basis.
If we collapse before then, well, we'll take a break at that stage. But otherwise, let's go on.
Thank you. 6.2 sets out the Welsh Minister's responsibilities. It's 6.3 that I'm interested in, which sets out Partnership and Velindre Trust's responsibilities of the effective day-to-day management and administration of WIBS. And this includes single point of contact for beneficiaries, reliable, responsible and accurate payments process, providing regular payments to beneficiaries, processing all applications to WIBS within required deadlines. And then over the page, the next 5 bullet points are what I really wanted to ask you questions about. Provision of free welfare rights advice from a dedicated team of trained advisors. Provision of welfare advice and support to beneficiaries and assistance with completing application forms and signposting to other NHS services. Establishing a single point of contact with DWP and HMRC to assist with queries regarding tax and benefit status of beneficiaries. Key worker support to help beneficiaries navigate the healthcare system. And a provision of dedicated wellbeing and psychology service available to all beneficiaries and their families. So, just pausing there in relation, can you tell us a little bit about the provision of the free welfare rights advice? We've heard from other schemes that they make referrals to welfare advisors who sit outside the schemes. Is that a different arrangement in WIBS?
Yes, it is. We have an in-house welfare team. So as we set out right at the very start of this afternoon, Velindre NHS Trust also hosts the Velindre Cancer Centre, and they had a very well-established and quality standard accredited welfare function. So when we established WIBS, it made sense for us, rather than to reinvent the wheel ourselves, to form a partnership arrangement and use the benefit of their expertise and knowledge. And so we have modelled our welfare team on their accredited model, and the welfare rights officers that work as part of WIBS are all CMAP accredited themselves as well, so they have a quality accreditation in terms of the advice that they give.
I've seen a document or a report authored by Ms. Swaffin Walker, which suggests that they not only respond to queries coming in from beneficiaries, but actually, certainly at some points, they've been proactively phoning up beneficiaries and finding out whether or not they might actually have a need for benefits advice. Is that your understanding of how they work?
Yes, so they did initially, when we were first established, they did contact all the beneficiaries to signpost and make them aware of the services that they would be able to provide. And then they also form the basis of most of the information that we put in our newsletter that goes out to all our beneficiaries as well, making them aware of the service that they offer and some of the successes, and a sort of anonymised case study basis that we've had in terms of gaining access to additional support for beneficiaries, as well as being what I would describe as a listening voice on the phone as well.
And is this right, that the assistance they provide includes benefits advice, budgeting advice, energy efficiency advice, support for housing costs, advice on inheritance, help accessing support groups and referrals to social workers?
That's correct.
And they, in terms of the benefits advice and assistance, they can, if necessary, assist somebody up to a tribunal if necessary.
Yes, we've never had to call upon that, but they would be able to do so, yes.
And so this is what's being, the welfare rights advice is a wide service that goes beyond simply looking at benefits. It's to look at a whole range of welfare services.
Yes, I would concur with that.
And is it also right that you have captured the numbers of people taking up this service?
Yes, I think my record was around just short of 50 beneficiaries, and a number of those beneficiaries would have regular contact with the team and may have made applications for support numerous times. And
so, as the second bullet point in the Memorandum of Understanding suggests, there's provision of direct welfare advice and support, and then there is the signposting to other services. Yes,
so where the beneficiary, the welfare team would undertake completion of application forms on the behalf of beneficiaries, so the team would conduct, prior to COVID, we would have done face-to-face visits, home visits, depending on what the beneficiary themselves felt more comfortable with. And then, yes, on the back of that, we may take forward an application with a third party for them.
And then the third bullet point down on the memorandum that we looked at was establishing a single point of contact with DWP and HMRC. Have you established such contacts?
Yes, we have.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. I spoke over you.
We have a named contact within the DWP and HMRC.
And so presumably the inquiry's heard evidence of difficulties that beneficiaries have sometimes when they either fail to declare their WIBS income, or they do declare their WIBS income, and then through data matching exercises, the DWP becomes concerned that they're fraudulently claiming benefits and calls them in, often under caution, for interviews. So are you aware that some of your beneficiaries have run into such difficulties?
Yes, unfortunately that has happened. And then the welfare team would intervene on their behalf, and we've always resolved the issues quite promptly once they've been escalated within DWP in the main, I would say. And I would, I'd hasten to add, I don't think there's any systemic issue here. It does always seem to have been as a result of an individual's misunderstanding or misinterpretation within DWP rather than any evidence of anything systemic.
And presumably that's the benefit of having a named contact, in that you can get that sorted out pretty quickly, because your named contact knows exactly what the position is.
Should be, indeed that.
And is that the sort of problem that you can provide your beneficiaries with a letter that sets out what all the obligations are of the various of their obligations and what the DWP ought to be doing with that? Is that something that you can do for beneficiaries?
Yes.
Then we come on to key worker support to help beneficiaries navigate the healthcare system. Can you explain to us how that works?
So it's the key worker is a separate hat that the welfare team would wear, if you like. So it would be the same individuals with a sort of shared skill set. So the key worker is where they may act more in an advocate type of capacity, where they would maybe contact the health board or local authority where there may be issues that they wish to try to resolve, and potentially where the individual may not have a nominated social worker. So it's really to support, to try to help translate sometimes what's happening or what processes may need to happen. It may be helping making appointments or booking appointments, that kind of thing equally as well.
And so the healthcare system and the social care system can sometimes be complex, and presumably your beneficiaries may have complex needs themselves. Would the key worker have an understanding and a knowledge about how to navigate one's way around the health and social care system?
Yes.
And just read out a paragraph in your witness statement where you've been asked to provide a narrative description of the kind of assistance provided, and you say this: assistance provided includes signposting psychological support prior to WIBS's own psychological service being offered, liaising with social workers to ensure complex beneficiaries' needs are met, signposting NHS-free dental care and prescription services for those eligible due to new benefit entitlement, chasing medical professionals for evidence to join the WIBS scheme, etc. Is the brief to the key worker really to do what the person needs, or is there a point at which the key worker might say, actually, that's not really my role, I'm not going to help you do X, Y, or Z?
I think the overarching spirit is that we would always try to go the extra mile to do what we can, but yes, there may in individual circumstances be certain limitations on what we feel we're able to do and might be appropriate to do.
And how does a beneficiary get a key worker? Do they ask for one, or do you identify that they need one? How does that work?
It would probably be more through contact with the welfare team initially, that they may identify that this is an individual who would benefit from a key worker role, and we would explain to them what we would be able to help them do to it. We probably wouldn't use the label of a key worker. We would probably talk about it more in generic terms of, assistance and help, that, we can help you do that. We can bring those people for you. We can help you fill in that form. So probably the label of a key worker is probably something we would use more so than maybe beneficiaries themselves would recognise.
And do you capture data as to how many people would take up that service?
No, we don't. We haven't been capturing the information around the key worker role. We've been only captured the contacts with the welfare team.
One of the issues that's been raised with the inquiry is the fact that it may not be very well known either by local authorities or by members of the scheme beneficiaries that their WIBS payments are to be disregarded for the purposes of financial assessments for care home fees. Is that an issue that has come across your desk, that you're aware that sometimes local authorities are, for example, taking those payments into account when they shouldn't be?
I'm aware of one very recent example that was brought to my attention that was identified by one of the welfare team, and it did get escalated up to myself, and we did seek some clarification from the Welsh Government on that, mainly because it hadn't arisen before. Certainly it hadn't been brought to our attention before, and I understand that we had advice then from Welsh Government as to what the form of words and which part of legislation and code of practice we could direct the relevant health board to.
And so that was an example, was it, where, again, WIBS can write a letter setting all of that out for the beneficiary to give to the relevant local authority?
Yes.
And is that information that is on your website, or you might consider putting on your website?
It's probably captured by the overarching welfare team, but certainly on reflection, there's always more that we can do potentially to promote the work. So, yes, that's something I can take on board.
And then lastly, in relation to the bullet points on the Memorandum of Understanding, we've got provision of a dedicated wellbeing and psychology service available to all beneficiaries and their families. And we heard a little bit of evidence about that this morning, but just from your perspective, can you just give us an outline as to how that works? Who provides the services? how people avail themselves of it and so on?
The clinical team are employed directly by the Linda NHS Trust. We currently have 2 members of the team, which is a full-time counsellor and then sessions provided by the clinical psychologist. The business case behind establishing the team was a sort of 4-tiered model, tier 1 being some basic education and information, tier 2 then moving up to more sort of support network groups, which we discussed earlier today, and then tier 3 would be more around counselling, not just for the individuals, but potentially also family-based counselling. And then tier 4 would be those in more clinical input and more acute support, and that would be provided by the clinical psychologist.
Do you capture data about how many people are using that service?
I think it's important to state that the clinical team use the sort of patient and clinical databases, and the rest of the team wouldn't have access to those clinical records and clinical files. But when I asked Dr. Coffey what the latest numbers were, we are providing counselling currently to around 25 beneficiaries, and she's providing clinical input to 5 currently.
And were they able to continue delivering that service during the pandemic and during the lockdowns?
We have been able to, where both the counsellor and the psychologist deemed that it was appropriate to continue on a sort of a virtual setting as we are now. So yes, I think it wouldn't be the ideal scenario that the team would want to be conducting the service, but we have managed to find a way through.
And do you know whether or not there are waiting lists for the service?
No, I'm not aware of a waiting list.
And are there any limits on the number of sessions or the type of help assistance that somebody can receive?
No, but I would probably refer more to Dr. Coffey rather than me make an assessment on that, because she would advise on how she is managing the service on that side of things.
I've just got one last question to ask, and it's Gemma, you can take that down, and it's just on funding. Is it right to understand that the scheme is 100% funded, i.e. that there wouldn't be a circumstance in which the scheme would be unable to make a payment because there wasn't funding for it?
That's correct, yes.
So could we now take a break so that call participants have an opportunity to put any questions that they want me to ask Mrs. Ramsey?
Well, let's take a break until 10 to 4. That's a little bit. Well, I hope that gives you enough time to sort out any problems with the Wi-Fi. If you need more time, please just be in touch, and we'll delay starting again. The one thing which I have to say to you, as I say to all witnesses, if there's any break in their evidence, is you're giving evidence. You are not permitted to talk to anyone, whoever they may be, about the evidence you've given, or you think you may yet be asked to give, but anything else you want, you can chat. I'll see you at 10 to 4.
Thank you.